Hello and welcome back to my channel. I thought it was about time to do a little update video on how the book is going because I, put out that video sometime last year saying, hey, I got a book deal. And then I've been very quiet. And that is because writing a book is not easy. To kind of catch you up, last March, I got a formal deal with HarperCollins Canada to write this book. And then ever since, I've been working tirelessly to make sure that I finish it by the deadline, which was January 31st, 2024. A lot has happened since then, but I want to give you just kind of my perspective on what the journey's been like so far. Now, what I will say is, and I'm very lucky because I have a lot of authors that come on my podcast. After we do our interview, I usually, just ask for an extra 5 minutes to be like, can I just ask you a few questions about what your experience was like? And not one author has had an identical experience. So it really depends, I think, on what publisher you go with, and also too, if you do self-publishing, that's a whole other thing, and then who your editor is, but also too, what your needs are. So for example, I've talked to lots of authors and they were given a very strict schedule from their publisher, like they have to submit new chapters every single month, they have to have monthly meetings, all that kind of stuff. That was not my experience. My experience, and this was kind of something that I guess I wanted a bit more, like I don't want to have meetings for no reason, and it just would make me super anxious to have to hand in everything every single month. For me, they said, we will see you in January with your full manuscript. If you need any guidance or help, let us know. And so there were a few points during the year that I, had some calls with my editor to discuss how things were moving forward and ask questions. But in general, I was just kind of left to my own devices for a whole year, which is great because that is actually kind of more my process. Just leave me alone and let me do it. But it was also pretty intimidating because I've never written a book before, and there probably are some courses or books about how to write a book. I certainly didn't do any of them. So I just wrote a book in the way that I thought made the most sense. With that, I needed some self-accountability. So I actually did create a little spreadsheet that I showed my editor. Just like, I've never seen any author ever do this. But it's what's, I like spreadsheets, obviously. And so this is what helped me keep very organized in terms of what chapters I'm writing, my word count. Here is an example of what it kind of looked like. And it was great because at the end of every, day or whenever I was finished writing something, I would update the word count for that chapter to see where I'm at. Now, of course, I like to talk. I like to write. I am very wordy. And so my original word count to hand in was 75,000 words. And when I handed it in, it was almost 90,000 words, which is not ideal. So that's what I've actually been really working on the past couple months, is trying to get that word count down. It's still going to be over 75,000 words. There's just a lot of important things that I think I need to say. So it is going to be a bit longer than anticipated. Now, the one thing that really helped me through this journey was obviously, having lots of conversations with other authors, just so you don't feel as alone. But honestly, what I did a ton of was reading. I read 21 books last year, lots of them for research purposes, some of them just so I can get into the mind of what are different ways you can format your book, which is crazy because I've talked to lots of other authors. They're like, I did not read any books the year I was writing mine because I didn't want to get confused. I didn't want it to just get in my head. But I think the difference is because the book that I'm writing isn't just a straight personal finance book. I didn't read personal finance books for this book. I read a lot of human behavior books and psychology books, ones that had to do with the topics in my book, but there's no way I could replicate what they were doing inside my book. They're very different books. But I found that to be super helpful. And then really just, the hardest part of writing a book I found is getting out of your own head. It took me a good few months to stop worrying about, is this going to be good? Am I going to finish this on time? What if no one likes it? What if my editor hates it? All this kind of stuff. You have to push that aside because that will just paralyze you and you'll never write anything. And so trying to more get into the mind of, I'm writing this book for me and for the people that I know will enjoy it. And that's it. Nothing else matters. Now, in terms of like the practicalities, if you're wondering, like, how did you go about it? So for me, I just kept everything in my Google Drive. I have one for my business. And so I had all these documents. Every chapter was its own Google Doc. And then, of course, I had that spreadsheet to keep me nice and organized. And any other kind of references or resources, I would usually keep a list of them or would just, again, footnote it so I know exactly where it is in the document. But also, I would just keep a bookmark folder on my main, internet browser so I can easily kind of recall it. But yeah, a lot of Googling. Found lots of things just on Google Scholar to find those research databases. But you may not know this, but depending on where you live, I live in Toronto. And so as a, member of the Toronto Public Library, they actually have a lot of free research databases that normally you would have to pay quite a bit of money to access, but you get them for free. And so if you're doing your own research for something, take a look at your library and you may have access to all these, and they're all online. You don't have to go to the library and you can access all those. And thankfully, I used that and did the majority of my research before the Toronto Public Library got a cyber attack, and then none of those were accessible anymore. Now, another thing that I thought was actually really interesting, and again, I thought maybe my publisher would do this. I had no idea. No, this is something that you have to do as an author on your own. But if you want anyone to consult or take a look at passages of your book to make sure, yes, this is correct or whatever from experts in the field, you have to do that on your own, and it's on your own dime. So for example, I've had lots of passages about psychology, so I had a psychotherapist look at some of those passages. I have a really big chapter on behavior economics, and luckily I was able to get an expert in that field also take a look at those sections. And of course, this is something becoming much more common with authors these days, which I think is great. I hired a few sensitivity consultants to take a look at some passages to also make sure that what I'm saying is not only accurate, but I'm using the right words, the right tone, and I'm not missing anything. You just wouldn't believe some of the turns of phrase that are, embedded in our vernacular that you may not realize is actually really ancient and really offensive. And you want to have someone with a second pair of eyes that does this all the time to be like, actually, let's use a different phrase for that. Like, for example, I just learned that the term rule of thumb is not okay to use anymore. And I use that term all the time. Literally every personal finance content creator uses the term rule of thumb, and it has a kind of dark past. So when I handed it in, I then had to basically copy and paste everything into one single Word doc and then send it to my editor. And then it's just kind of like anything you would edit. It's just in that review function on Word, and then we just have comments, and then we go back and forth and change things. Then we have a few meetings to discuss what should be changed. For me, it really was just getting that word count down. I had to change one chapter. It was later. I put it earlier, and it did have a better flow to it. But I was pretty lucky in that there wasn't much to change in terms of how it flowed and formatted, or I didn't have to get rid of a whole chapter, or there wasn't a ton of shifting. And I was really worried, is this going to be a completely different book than the original manuscript? So far, it's not. Really, it's just about kind of making things a little bit more succinct. And also, I did have a tendency to sometimes go into the weeds with certain topics that really, I'm like, we don't have to talk about the history of the world to make your point. Let's get back to the point, and then trying to kind of remember what we're doing. So for what's next, it goes to a copy editor who really takes a look at grammar, sentence structure, things like that, and then legal to make sure I'm not gonna get sued. And then once that's all nicely done and everything's approved, then we start formatting it for the actual book, what it'll look like. And now we're having conversations about cover and title. And then the cover will be really exciting because I have no idea. Obviously, I gave them some suggestions on book covers that I really like to emulate, and we'll kind of see where we go from there. But yeah, that's kind of the next phase of this book process. So that's really it. That's all I've got to share right now. I will definitely make another video once everything is completely done. But to give you an idea of, when is this coming out? When can you pre-order? Likely pre-orders will happen, I think, in the fall. And then the book should be out early January, very early New Year, January. So that's what's going to happen. And I am absolutely going to do some events. Definitely one in Toronto, definitely one in Vancouver for my hometown friends, family, but also people who have been subscribing to this channel or listening to the podcast or whatever. So definitely going to do 2 events. And We'll see if I do other events throughout Canada, but you know, you never know. We'll see what happens. So that's really it. That's the update. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to everyone who's been really supportive of this book, and I cannot wait until you can read it.